There are many ways to make art, and many things to make art with. This may seem like a really obvious thing to say, but when we think about the array of choices at every artist's disposal, it becomes interesting to think about why they chose the subject, the style and technique, and the material that they did rather than anything else. And when faced with a challenging artwork that may not make sense at first glance, thinking about the choices the artist made can help us to understand it a bit more. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the decisions that artists make about how they make art and what the impact of those choices is, especially for us as viewers. Here is an example. Claude Toussignon is an important artist whose work is part of a movement or style called geometric abstraction. On one hand, this is a fancy art term, but on the other, as soon as you see this work, you know what it's all about. Toussignon was among a group of artists who felt that painting should only be about color and form. This was in the 1960s, and artists like Toussignon thought that painting was no place for meaning or self-expression. The work was all about color and the effects that placing colors side by side have on our vision. It is so strict in its smooth surface and spacing that it could almost have been made by a machine, or by any other person following this artist's instructions. The intense colors almost seem to vibrate when you see this in real life, and it is this kind of effect that Toussignon was interested in exploring. Now we compare it to a work by another artist Secunda. Once again, we see a work composed of brightly colored concentric circles, so there is a lot that is the same in these two artworks, but the choice of materials and the method of creation are very different. Can you tell how he made this? Well, it is hard to tell in slides. These two works are quite close in size, and the colors are quite similar too. Even the dates these two works were made are very close. Toussignon in 1968 and Secunda in 1972. Using this slide of both works together, pause the video for a moment to talk about the similarities and differences. How do you feel, and what do you notice when you look at each work? We've already discussed that Toussignon was working to create a cold and disconnected sense of the work, no emotion or reference to the real world. His is a painting that is intellectual, all about ideas. The process of making it and the artist himself are irrelevant. This work is just about the work. The paint is smooth, strictly measured, and all the colors are the same intensity or brightness. There is no sense of the artist's hand, no brushstrokes or marks. Secunda, on the other hand, is quite different, and I would argue that this is due to his choice of material and method. While his color and his design are quite similar, he has chosen to use scraps of ripped paper in a range of shades. Look how many different shades of blue or red you can see. He has arranged them in a circle, but because of the torn edges and the looser attention to geometric form, the circles are uneven and rough. They are also tucked into layers rather than being glued flat, so this work seems like a tunnel of color burrowing into the center. He has amplified this sense by making the inner circles narrower than the outer rings. You see the technique he used very clearly, and so you can see what we call the hand of the artist, the way the artist applies the materials to the surface of the artwork. Often we talk about brushstrokes, but here we talk about ripped and layered pieces of paper. As compared to the cold, calculated work of Toussignon, this piece is busy, uneven, and organic. To further this analysis, think for a moment about how these two objects were made. Toussignon would have used geometry tools, a compass to draw perfect circles, and a ruler to measure the exact distance between each circle. Likely he would also have used some kind of color guide to ensure that the correct selection of colors, so that they are all of the same level of intensity, and also to plan the order of each color. Each would have been placed carefully, painting to stay within the lines with no room for error. Secunda, on the other hand, would have been far more experimental and playful. While I am not certain of his process, I would imagine first he would have gathered colored papers together and torn them into rough rectangular shapes. I expect then he would have made piles of each color, all the blues, the yellows, and the reds, and so on together, to collect them into organized system. Next, he would have a process of building up a layer at a time, possibly trying out different pieces and combinations as he went. In each case, the process and the materials change the way we respond to the work, and the way we can interpret the way that they were working. In each case, the process would have been slow and methodical, a meditative experience for some, an exercise in frustration for others. Now, take a moment to imagine what each artist's studio might have looked like. When we encounter works of modern art, particularly abstract paintings from the 1950s and 60s, some people find themselves wondering about the significance or importance of these seemingly simple works. The installation shot of a few works from the AGH collection is a great example. Is there one work that stands out particularly for you? There are a lot of striking works here, but when I have toured this exhibition, there are often some questions about that small blue square just off the center. People ask, what is that? Why is that there? And how can that be art? Some of this confusion comes from an ingrained idea that we have that making art needs to be hard, that there are only a few special people with the technical skill to make good art. And so, by that logic, painting a 6 by 6 inch square blue doesn't seem to make any sense. Anyone can do that, they say to me. And it's true, anyone could. But that is not really the point. Art is about ideas and pushing boundaries. Artists respond to those who have come before them and work to explore their ideas and push them to their fullest potential. If you look around the wall in this image, you can see a step-by-step journey that begins with the notion of a painting as an illusion of space, a window into another world where the artist has rendered each detail perfectly. In later works, artists become more interested in painting, the colors, the action of the paintbrush, and the surface of the canvas. Emily Carr begins to use dabs of color in her work, unmixed brushstrokes that make her sky almost sparkle in the sunny blue sunshine. Tom Thomson plays with the lines and patterns of birch trees in a forest, with bright colors and very little interest in showing us a three-dimensional space. He's chosen the elements that are important for him in this painting, and an illusion of the real world is not it. In a later work, we see Lauren Harris exploring color, line, and brushstrokes in this painting of a waterfall. We can still recognize the landscape as the subject, but that is becoming less and less important with each step. This really is a painting all about painting. And so, some years later, we arrive at a little blue square. The artist is Claude Toussignaud, who we saw a little earlier. He has taken the ideas started by earlier artists and pushed them as far as they'll go. This is a painting about color, and nothing else. Toussignaud has managed to eliminate any reference to the real world altogether. This may seem obvious to us now as we look back in time, but at the time it was made, it was rather revolutionary. And it is works like this that paved the way for a whole new kind of art making, art that was about ideas and not just about a skill. Can you think of any other artists that you know whose work was made possible by artists like this? In one more example of how we got here, let's start in 1887 with a small still life painting. This painting is very traditional. By 1887, the genre of still life is already almost 200 years old, and it carries with it a language of symbols and showing off. A still life is a painting of objects, sometimes fancy, sometimes ordinary. The choice of objects can tell us a lot. If a patron hires an artist to paint a still life, it can sometimes act almost like a portrait. The selection of items tells a story about that person. We could learn what they liked, their hobbies, and perhaps some family history, but also how wealthy, educated, or religious they were. The selection can also be useful to the artist. Very ornate and especially reflective surfaces required a great deal of skill, so including those things allowed the artist to show others how good their work was. That's the showing off part. Now for the symbols. In the 17th century, Dutch painters created a special type of painting called vanitas. Loosely translated, it means soon you will die. These paintings contained items to remind the viewer that life, wealth, and good fortune were fleeting. Fresh fruit was often sliced, meat was cut, and flowers slightly wilted, in each case suggesting that they would soon rot. Some artists went as far as including insects, skulls, and candles that had just been extinguished. This is an artist who followed that tradition. The large fruit in the background and the smaller one in front have been sliced, and we can even still see the knife. A bundle of flowers lies on the counter, and there isn't even a fly. Interestingly, we also have a jar with preserved fruit inside. What do you think that could suggest? Now jump ahead about 200 years and we find another artist working in the same tradition. Here we see a work called Killer Still Life, and once again we see a collection of objects that signify death. In this case, the artist hasn't bothered to paint the objects. He just arranged the actual containers on a shelf as the artwork. While the art form is different, the same symbolic language is used. This artist uses the long-standing tradition of still life to communicate contemporary ideas about life and death, particularly framed by the environmental awareness of the time. In another contemporary still life, we find the work of Hamilton artist Fiona Kinsella. Like the previous artist, Kinsella uses the real objects in her work, and there is an immediacy to this work that causes viewers to have very strong reactions. Bones, hair, claws, and teeth are common materials in Kinsella's work, and all point back to that tradition of vanitas, reminding us of the passing of time. In each of these cases, we see artists who have made very important choices in their work, what objects they will include, what method of art making, and in each case the choices have a very dramatic effect on how we see and how we think about these works. One of the interesting things that happens when we gather to talk about artworks and the artists who made them is that we can develop a new connection to the work. An artwork that you might have initially disliked or been totally uninterested in can actually become something that you talk about for a long time. While you may not change your mind about liking or disliking it, you will often find that the artists who have successfully captured your attention, either because you like the work or because it provokes strong feelings for you, become the ones you want to come back and see again and again. Today's slides offer a good representation of the work discussed, but they cannot replace the experience of seeing them in person. If you can, please take some time to visit the gallery. Spend some time looking, seeing if you can spot the choices that the artist made and try and figure out why they made them. I promise it will be worth your while.